I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, and I've traveled at night so many times that I stopped worrying about what might happen on deserted roads. But what happened that night? I still don't know how to explain it. I was going from Oklahoma to Texas, a long, smooth trip without much movement on the road. The radio was on, playing some song, and I felt kind of lost in it, in that silence and darkness, you know? The truck's lights were about the only thing I could see ahead. The road seemed like a tunnel of infinite darkness. It was when I passed through an area with no cell phone signal that it started. I was looking in the rearview mirror, like I always do, and I saw something, a shadow. I still don't know how to describe it. It looked more like a silhouette than something with a defined shape. It was big, it seemed to move around in the back seat, but it didn't seem to move in a normal way. I froze for a second. I looked again and saw nothing. I took a deep breath, laughing at myself for being scared by nothing. When the shadow appeared again, it was much closer this time. It was clearer, as if the outline had become clearer. And this feeling was different, it didn't just seem like an illusion. It was as if something was really there, somehow. I stopped the truck on the side of the road, my heart pounding. The night was very strange. I got out, looked inside the truck, checked the back seat, but everything was empty. I even looked in the cargo compartment, but nothing. No sign that anyone was there. I got back behind the wheel, feeling that discomfort spreading throughout my body. I tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe it was tiredness, the starlight casting strange shadows, or even a faulty rear-view mirror. But the feeling that something was there, in the darkness, did not disappear. And then, it happened again. This time, the shadow appeared even more visible, as if it was almost touching my head, as if it were watching me. I turned the steering wheel to try to get a better look in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing else. I accelerated the truck, trying to shake the feeling that something was there. I don't know why, but the longer I looked in the rearview mirror, the longer the shadow seemed to persist. It always looked a little different, like it was moving, but I could never really see what it was. It seemed like she was trying to attract me, make me more attentive to her. Every time I looked, it was a new scare, a feeling that something was approaching me, but without ever actually materializing. I passed a few more deserted areas, empty roads that gave the feeling of an entire world being swallowed by darkness. I think it was around 3 a.m., when I started to feel pressure in my chest, an anxiety that didn't make sense. I was on an even more isolated road, with tall trees on both sides, and it was there that the shadow appeared again, this time very large, as if it had grown, almost covering the entire rear-view view. It was the strangest feeling, as if I had the impression that I was being watched by someone who was right behind me. I broke out in a cold sweat, my entire body was shaking, and I didn't know what to do. I stopped the truck again, more scared than before. I left quickly. I looked everywhere, feeling stupid, but at the same time afraid of finding something I didn't want to see. The back seat was empty. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the roar of the truck engine. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself that I was just going crazy. But when I got back in and looked in the rearview mirror, there it was, the shadow, once again. I could see it moving from side to side, as if it were a presence trying to follow me. It was then that, almost by accident, my gaze went straight to the back seat. And I saw it. Something was there. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a recognizable shape, but I knew I wasn't alone. It wasn't like a person, but more like a presence. The back seat felt empty, but the feeling that something was right there, in the empty space, was enough to make me freeze in my seat. I stared at the rearview mirror, waiting for the shadow to disappear like the previous times, but it didn't. On the contrary, it seemed like she was closer. I didn't know what to do. The feeling that something was there, watching, was so strong that I could barely breathe. It was as if the shadow had materialized in my mind, and every movement I made seemed to amplify the fear. I tried to start the truck and drive forward, but I couldn't take my eyes off the rear-view mirror. What was that? What was happening? I tried to think of any rational explanation, but nothing made sense. Just fear, that feeling of dread taking over me. For a moment, I thought it was all a nightmare. The road stretched out in front of me, endless and empty. I was trying to force myself to focus, try to forget what was happening, but the rear-view mirror kept drawing me back. I looked at him one more time, and this time I saw something that made me stop the truck in the middle of the road. The shadow was moving clearer, more defined, as if there really was something there, something I couldn't see directly but knew was getting closer. It was no longer an illusion, no longer a distant shadow. It was real. I stopped, pulled over the truck and just stood there, looking in the rear-view mirror. My heart was racing, my palms were sweaty, and I was paralyzed. I didn't want to get out of the truck, I didn't want to check again. But I knew I needed it, I had to understand what was happening. I opened the door, the cold wind hitting my face, and ran to the back of the truck. Nothing. The bench was empty. I looked around, at the road, at the darkness of the trees. Nothing. I took one last look inside the truck, and when I looked back at the rearview mirror, the shadow simply disappeared. It wasn't like other times, when it disappeared and came back. No, this time, she disappeared at once, as if she had never existed. I stayed there for a few minutes, not knowing if I was relieved or even more scared. The rest of the trip went smoothly, but the feeling that something was watching me, that something was still there, accompanied me until the end. When I arrived at my destination, I went straight to the hotel, and I haven't looked in the rearview mirror since. I still don't know what I saw that night, but what scares me most is that, until now, I don't know if it was real or just something my mind made up. I was traveling on I-80, a pretty desolate stretch, passing through an area of open country. It was nighttime, and I was driving alone, which is nothing unusual for a truck driver. The radio was off, which made the silence heavier. The truck's headlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the road in front of me, but other than that, nothing else was visible. There wasn't much movement that night, which gave me the feeling that I was the only living being on that stretch of road. It was around midnight when the first truck overtook me. It was an old model, but well-maintained, with yellow lights on. When I passed him, I noticed that the driver seemed silent, without making any signs. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the other truck seemed to be going faster, I tried to speed up a little to get a better look at it. The curious thing is that, a few kilometers ahead, the same truck passed me again, so unexpectedly that it made me frown. He was ahead of me again, but this time he seemed further away. I was uncomfortable, but I thought maybe it was a faster truck driver passing me repeatedly. What really bothered me was that, not long after, the truck overtook again, and this time it seemed even faster, almost as if it was dematerializing. The feeling that something was wrong came over me. I accelerated, tried to keep up with the truck, but it disappeared ahead, as if it had disappeared into the void of the road. I knew it wasn't a glitch in my eyes or anything like that. Each time the truck disappeared, I felt the emptiness of the road and a cold sensation in my chest, as if I had been tested. I went after him once again, almost desperate, trying to understand what was happening. But it didn't take long for, once again, the truck reappeared, in exactly the same place, overtaking me. It was like he was teasing me. Something was wrong, and I couldn't understand what it was. It was as if the road, the weather, and that truck were playing some kind of game with me. I started to get paranoid. The truck passed me, and it seemed that each time it was moving away faster, as if I were in a race against something impossible to reach. When I saw him for the fourth time, my heart almost stopped. He was so distant now, as if he had disappeared completely. I tried to accelerate more, almost without thinking, but nothing. The truck just disappeared from my sight again, and it was like I was chasing a shadow. The feeling that something was wrong became unbearable. I stopped on the side of the road, with the truck's engine still running, and looked back, hoping to see something. But the road was empty. There was no sign of any other vehicles, not even the sound of other cars or trucks. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but something inside me already knew there was no logical explanation for what was happening. I decided to continue, more cautiously, but with a growing feeling that the road was swallowing me in some way. It was then that, as I accelerated again, the truck appeared once again. Only this time, he was so close that he made me jump in my chair. I couldn't even process what was happening. He was there, next to me, moving along with my truck, but somehow, he was overtaking. I tried to look out the window, but the truck was so close it felt like the lights were blinding me. There was no way it could be real. When I looked ahead again, the truck was in front of me, as if it had come out of nowhere. The fear was overwhelming. I sped up, trying to finally understand what was happening, trying to make that truck disappear once and for all, but suddenly it disappeared like before, without a sound, without a warning. Just emptiness. I was shaking, sweat running down my forehead. I tried to convince myself that it was all just tiredness or my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. When the truck disappeared last time, I didn't try to look for it anymore. I moved on, but the road never looked the same again. I can't explain what happened, but I know it wasn't normal. The journey continued in silence, but I was far from feeling at ease. Every kilometer seemed longer, and the road stretched endlessly in front of me, as if I were stuck in some kind of loop. I stared at the headlights, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, that something was still following me. But the truck never appeared again. After a while, I started to think that my mind had really played tricks on me. Maybe the tiredness, the hours of driving non-stop, had messed with my head. I reached the destination without further incident, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. I couldn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain what I saw without sounding crazy. The worst thing is that, every time I think about that road, I have the same feeling. As if time had bent or something had happened there, something I can't understand. I still drive by those roads, but I never saw that truck again. The truth is, to this day, I don't know if what happened was real or if I was just at the edge of my mind. But every time I return to those roads, a part of me wonders if, somewhere, that truck is still there, waiting to pass me once again. And if you do, will it disappear again? Or will he take me somewhere where the roads have no end? I know I may never have an answer, but something inside me still tells me that no matter how hard I try to forget, that truck will never truly disappear. And every time I look in the rearview mirror, I wonder if I'll ever see him again. I really hope not. I had been traveling on the main road for a few hours now and the exhaustion was kicking in. The clock was already showing 2 a.m., and I knew I needed a break before continuing the journey. Those long drives at night, alone, always left me with a strange feeling, as if the silence of the road was dragging with me. That's when I saw a small sign on the side of the road indicating a parking lot. It was empty, there was no other truck or vehicle in sight. I decided to stop there to rest a little. Maybe it was one of those half-abandoned places, but what I needed was sleep. The place felt a little isolated, as if no one had used it for days. The parking lot was large, but what caught my attention was the total absence of any signs of life. There were no lights, there were no other vehicles, and most of all, there was no one. I parked my truck in the far corner, turned off the engine, and closed my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the profound silence. The kind of silence that seemed to be swallowed by darkness. But even so, I couldn't relax completely. That's when the sound started. First, there was a slight clicking noise, as if someone were walking back and forth outside. It wasn't anything very strong, but the feeling that there was something or someone nearby was undeniable. I turned around, looked out the window, but only saw the darkness of the night. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind, fatigue playing tricks on me. I lay back down, trying to ignore the noise. But he continued. Soft footsteps, as if someone was walking around my truck. Each time I tried to relax, the sound became clearer, closer. They weren't fast steps, but those slow, calculated steps, as if someone was trying to spy on me without being seen. The strangest thing of all is that every time I looked out the window, there was no one there. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something wasn't right there. Dread took over me, a feeling of increasing claustrophobia. The worst was when I heard a soft knock on the cabin door. I froze. The sound was so real, so clear, as if someone was trying to enter. I lay there, motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The knock on the door still echoed in my mind, but when I looked, there was absolutely nothing. The parking lot was as empty as before, without a sign of life. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was the wind or some other rational explanation, but my entire body was on alert. The fear was starting to creep in, and the feeling that I wasn't alone was intensifying. But I still forced myself to remain calm. I tried to lie down again and close my eyes, but the silence of the night was now filled with tension. The footsteps started again. This time, they were closer, as if someone was circling around the truck, stopping every now and then, only to start again. I could hear the sound of the concrete floor pressing down, as if someone's weight was there, just a few feet away. The feeling that I was being watched made me feel butterflies in my stomach. I looked at the windows again, but the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. There was no one anywhere, but the footsteps didn't stop. When the sound of the knock on the door repeated, louder this time, I almost jumped out of bed. I knew it wasn't the wind, it wasn't my mind. I could feel the presence of someone or something, right there. I got up, hesitantly, and went to the window, trying to peek without being seen, but the darkness didn't let me see anything but shadows. Suddenly, a short, muffled scream echoed in the distance, followed by absolute silence. The sound of the scream was so clear and so close that my body froze in place. I could no longer ignore the feeling that there was something wrong with this place. I quickly went to the cab of the truck, unlocked the door and looked outside, but everything was quiet. There was nothing, no explanation for what was happening. My heart was pounding, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I looked at the clock, which said 3:30 in the morning, and fear began to take over me. Something was moving, around the parking lot. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. I was no longer alone. Something or someone was waiting for me, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist this feeling of being hunted. Fear turned into panic. I could no longer control the shaking of my hands, and sweat was running down my forehead. I looked around once more, but the darkness seemed to swallow me. I didn't know what it was, but the feeling that something was approaching, something that shouldn't be there, became unbearable. The parking lot was empty, but in my mind, I knew I wasn't alone. The knock on the door returned, louder now, as if someone was trying to force entry. I couldn't take it anymore. I got into the truck, started the engine and started driving without thinking. The road was darker than ever, and the silence that had once felt comfortable was now charged with horrible tension. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. just the empty road behind me. When I looked out the window again, something moved quickly in the darkness, something big. My stomach turned. What was that? I accelerated the truck, not knowing if I was running away or just trying to get out of an impossible situation. That's when, without warning, the knock on the door came again, only this time closer, as if someone was next to me, touching the glass. I was so scared that I almost lost control of the truck. I looked out the window once more, but the road was empty. There was nothing else. The sound stopped. Silence returned. Only now, it was heavier, more oppressive. I knew that what happened in that parking lot had no explanation. It wasn't a trick of my mind. Something was there, something I didn't see, but felt with all its intensity. I never went back to that parking lot. I never looked for a place to rest in isolated areas again. The fear of being alone in some unknown place, of hearing those footsteps, of feeling that strange presence, haunts me to this day. And even though I try to move forward, I always ask myself, what was really waiting for me in that parking lot? And why, to this day, can I not forget the sounds of what was there, but which I never saw? I was driving along an isolated road, it was already dawn, and tiredness was starting to take its toll. The CB radio was on, as always, and I was listening to those truck drivers' conversations, when something different happened. At first, I thought it was just a normal transmission, a call from some other driver, but when I heard the distress call, a strange feeling settled in my chest. The voice was desperate, a little muffled, but still clear. "Help, someone, please help me," she repeated, and what made my blood run cold was the tone. The voice was familiar. But I didn't know where. I was alone, with no one around, and the only sound coming from the radio was that voice asking for help. I looked around, as if expecting to see someone on the road, but everything was quiet. I looked at the truck's dashboard, trying to understand what was happening. It wasn't possible. How could a familiar voice be asking for help in such a deserted place? I picked up the radio microphone and tried to respond, but before I could speak, the voice repeated, "Please, someone, I'm lost." I paused for a second, trying to process it. It was then that the penny dropped. The voice was not that of another driver. It was mine. I froze. My own distress call was coming over the radio, and I hadn't said anything. My stomach dropped, and panic began to take over me. It couldn't be possible. How was this happening? I looked at the CB radio, as if it were the cause of all this despair. The only explanation I could think of was that something was interfering with the transmission. But how did that explain the voice being mine? I was paralyzed, but I couldn't ignore it. I decided to investigate. I started looking for the radio, trying to understand what was going on. I turned it off and on several times, but the voice kept coming somehow. I started to search the cabin, looking everywhere, but there was nothing left. The radio was intact, and there was no one with me. The sound of the radio seemed louder now, the voice clearer, as if it were closer. I didn't know what to do. Fear began to consume me, but I knew I needed answers. The voice was calling me, somehow, but there was nothing to explain it. I started checking the radio controls again, pressing all the buttons, trying unsuccessfully to cut off the transmission. But no matter how hard I tried, the voice persisted, getting louder, more distressing. That repeated cry for help seemed more like an echo, but of something very real. The voice, my voice, screamed for help, and I couldn't understand why. How was it possible? I was alone, on the road, with no one around. The feeling that someone was watching invaded me, and the tension only increased. Then, suddenly, the radio went completely silent. I was still trying to react, but now all I could hear was the sound of the truck's engine and the road ahead. The silence was oppressive, but at the same time, the relief I felt was instantaneous, as if something had been taken away from me. But this relief was short-lived. It wasn't long until, again, the voice came, this time clearer and more direct, "I know where you are." The sentence was so clear that it made me shiver. My heart accelerated. I looked at the radio, now certain that I wasn't just hearing things. Something was communicating with me. Something that knew where I was. I accelerated the truck, feeling a growing dread. The road in front of me seemed longer and emptier than ever. I was hoping the voice would go away, but it didn't. It continued, always at a distance, like a whisper in the air, but still very clear. "I'm here, you won't be able to get away." Those words sounded on the radio, and I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I was being followed, by something or someone, and it was starting to consume me. I didn't know how to react. I just wanted to get out of there, but it seemed like the voice was following me, watching me. Suddenly, a loud crack on the radio made me jump out of my seat. The sound was so loud that I almost broke the connection. I looked around, but there was nothing. The road was empty. The voice stopped again, but the feeling of being watched only increased. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, but the road remained empty. I tried to convince myself that this was all some kind of glitch, some transmission error, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I knew something strange was happening, something I couldn't understand, and the voice, that voice that seemed to know me, continued to torment me. I was completely out of my mind. The voice kept resonating in my mind, and the silence of the road only added to the weight on my shoulders. With each passing kilometer, I felt more trapped, as if the road were a trap. I looked at the radio, and before I could react, the voice came again, this time clearer than ever, "You already know what happened. You already know." I didn't understand what that meant. My mind was on the verge of collapse. What were they trying to tell me? What was happening to me? I sped up even more, trying to get away from it, but the more I sped up, the closer the voice seemed to get. It was like I was inside my own truck. I looked around, expecting to see something, anything, but nothing. The radio was silent again, and the strange feeling that something was about to happen intensified. The road seemed to never end, and I felt like I was somehow being pulled towards a destination I didn't know. There was no more control, there was no more explanation for what was happening. Suddenly the radio went silent. There was no sound. For a moment, I thought it was all over, that I was free, but when I looked at the dashboard, the radio display started flashing. And then, one last sentence was broadcast, a sentence that chilled me to the bone: "You will return, and the radio will be waiting for you." I stopped the truck immediately, my body shaking non-stop. I looked around, but there was no one, nothing but the emptiness of the road in front of me. I was unable to continue the journey. I turned off the radio and stood there in the dark for longer than I cared to admit. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The radio never worked the same way again, and I never heard that voice again. But something inside me still knows that that experience wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a technical failure. Something or someone was communicating with me, and to this day, I don't know what it all meant. I just know that every time I see that CB radio, a part of me wonders, what, or who, is still waiting for me. I was in the middle of a long trip, traveling along a road that seemed to never end. It was already night, the sky was dark and the truck's lights only illuminated a portion of the road ahead. The GPS was guiding me, but I started to notice that it was recalculating the route strangely. At first I thought it was just a glitch, but soon he sent me on a detour, a side road that I had never seen before. It wasn't the usual route, but I thought it was just a quicker alternative, so I followed it. The road seemed more and more deserted as I went along. The trees around were dense and closed, forming a kind of shadowy tunnel that swallowed the light from the headlights. I tried looking in the rearview mirror, but I saw nothing but darkness. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of the truck's engine and the occasional noise from the road. There was no sign of life, no house, no other vehicle, nothing. With every kilometer I covered, the feeling of isolation increased. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but the GPS kept insisting, guiding me along this unfamiliar road. After a while, the landscape began to look even stranger. The trees were taller, the shadows deeper. The asphalt looked older, full of cracks and signs of wear. I didn't remember seeing this type of road before. It was as if I had entered some place outside of time, where normal no longer existed. I looked at the GPS, hoping it would give me a clearer direction, but it only showed the same route, with no detours or options to turn back. It was then that I realized I was spinning around. I passed a spot that looked familiar, but I was sure I hadn't seen it before. Fear began to grow inside me. How was I returning to the same place without realizing it? I looked at the GPS again, and it still showed me the same road, as if it were a loop. I tried to stop and turn around, but the road seemed to have no end. At every turn, I felt more lost. I was somewhere, but I couldn't find a way out. I started to accelerate, trying to gain more speed, hoping to find something, anything that would tell me I wasn't stuck here. But no matter how far I drove, the trees remained the same distance away, the road curving and stretching before me with no sign of changing. I looked at the dashboard, looking for any indication that there was another road, but there was nothing. Just that damn GPS, insistent, showing the same path, with no alternatives. Fear consumed me, and I realized that I was no longer as calm as before. I felt like I was in a slow-motion nightmare, like I was trapped in a space where time didn't pass, and everything around me was the same. Darkness swallowed the road, and I had the feeling I was being watched, but whenever I looked outside, I saw nothing. No houses, no distant lights, no shadows beyond the trees that stretched like walls around the road. I was completely alone. It was then that I realized something even more disturbing. The road seemed to be getting narrower. The asphalt, which had previously been reasonably good, was now full of holes and deeper cracks. The trees got closer and closer to the banks, creating an even tighter tunnel, as if I was being led into something, not out. I looked at the GPS again, hoping to see some change, something that would tell me I was going to the right place, but all it showed was the same road, the same path. I was losing control of the situation. The tiredness, the panic, everything mixed together. I tried to turn the steering wheel to take a road that appeared to the left, but as I did so, I came across the same curve as always, the same spot where I had been before. I was no longer driving forward, it was going in circles. The road had no end. The GPS, which was supposed to guide me, now seemed to mock me, as if it was leading me to a destination I couldn't escape. I began to understand, I was not lost. I was trapped. I stopped the truck, desperate, and got out, trying to understand what was happening. The night was darker than ever, and the cold wind bit my face. The road seemed to be falling apart around me, and I was no longer sure where I was or where I was going. I walked to the edge of the road, but there was nothing but trees and more trees, and a growing feeling that the environment was closing in on me. The pressure in my chest was increasing, as if something invisible was pushing me back toward the truck. I went back to the cabin, trying to make sense of it all, but the GPS continued to show the same route. There were no more options, there were no more alternatives. It was as if the device was imprisoning me, forcing me to continue in circles. I looked out the window and saw the same spot ahead, that curve, those trees, that stretch of road, as if I were trapped inside an endless loop. I tried to start the engine again, but before I could follow, the truck's radio screeched and a faint voice came over the speaker, "You'll never get out." The voice echoed through the cabin like a muffled scream, and my stomach turned. I didn't know if I was delusional, if my mind was playing games with me, but everything seemed more and more real. The feeling of being trapped, of not being able to escape, was so strong that I almost gave up. The GPS was now flashing, and the voice became clearer every moment. "Go back to where you started," she whispered. I was beginning to realize that the road wasn't just physical. It was something more. Something that attracted me, that kept me there, with no chance of escape. I continued to roll, not knowing how long, but then, finally, the road opened up in front of me. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if reality had kicked in again, but when I looked out the window, I saw a clean, lit road, as if I was finally leaving that nightmare. The landscape looked familiar, but I knew it wasn't the same. Something had changed. And before I could process it, the GPS finally recalculated and showed a new route, a true route, no detours, no mysteries. I moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something was still watching me, waiting for me to come back. When I finally reached my destination, the relief was almost unbearable. But what happened on that road, what I experienced that night, will never leave my mind. The GPS is still in the truck, but I never trusted it the same way again. And whenever I find myself on an isolated road, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, is still there, waiting to take the unexpected detour once again.